Good morning to everyone. I'm Barbara Bundy, the Executive Director of the Center for the Pacific Rim here at the University of San Francisco, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to our conference on Hong Kong's reversion to Chinese sovereignty and its impact on Greater China. This promises to be a great 2 days, and we're delighted to have such a distinguished panel of speakers from Hong Kong, the mainland, Taiwan, and throughout the United States. And we thank all of our speakers for traveling long distances to be with us. I'd also like to welcome all of you on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, for which this program is a key event this year. Our dean is going to be with us later. The Center for the Pacific Rim and our Ricci Institute, which is part of the center, and our master's program in Asia-Pacific Studies, and a new book prize, the Kiriyama Pacific Rim Book Prize that we administer, are all part of the College of Arts and Sciences here at the University of San Francisco. Let me say that we have given you materials on who we are and what we do, so I won't take time at this point because we want to get into our conference agenda. But let me welcome all of you, if you have a moment, to come upstairs and visit the rest of the Center for the Pacific Rim and the Ricci Institute. Our administrative office for the center is in Lone Mountain 200, especially if you should need some help from Kristen Elbers, our secretary. And our research facilities and the Ricci Institute offices are directly above here, right off the Lone Mountain Library. We have a magnificent 75,000 volume East Asian library, the core of which is a very special Jesuit Chinese library, and we welcome you to visit us. We're very pleased to have some very special people with us this morning that we were fortunate to get who won't be able to stay for the entire conference. And let me just make a note that two of these people are Dean Orville Schell from the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley, and Mike Chinoy, who is the CNN Bureau Chief for Hong Kong. Let me just make a note, if I may, that we have Walden Books selling Mike Chinoy's new book, China Live, out here, and they will be with us until 2 o'clock today. So if you do want to purchase a book, you should plan to do so by 2 p.m. And unfortunately, Mike Chinoy has to leave in the middle of the morning after his talk because he's speaking at UC Berkeley, so you perhaps won't have a chance to have him autograph your book. We've already received many questions about getting copies of the papers, etc., and I know that the chair of our conference, Professor Uhaley, will have more to say about that. But let me just say we do plan to publish a complete summary of the conference, and please give your name and address to Professor Uhaley or one of us, myself, Father Malatesta, or Kristen Elbers, and we will make sure that you get a copy of the complete summary of the conference. I would also like to say, before introducing my colleague who is the founding director of our Ricci Institute for Chinese Western Cultural History, I would like to say that this event is made possible because we have a very special resource at the Center for the Pacific Rim and Ricci Institute, and that is an endowed chair, the Kiriyama Chair for Pacific Rim Studies, which was endowed in 1994 with an extraordinarily generous gift from Reverend Seiyu Kiriyama, president of Agonshu Association in Japan. And we're very pleased to have with us this entire year as the first chairholder of the Kiriyama Chair, Professor Stephen Uhaley, who is chairing the conference today. And it's only because we have a person of his distinction and capabilities that we were able to organize this extraordinary event. And so our gratitude goes to Professor Uhaley for everything he has done for us this year. We're also, of course, honored to have one of the elder statespersons of Asian Studies with us to provide the conference summation, and that is Dr. Robert Scalapino. So on that note, without further ado, let me introduce my esteemed colleague, Father Edward Malatesta of the Society of Jesus, who will also join in a few words of welcome. Father Malatesta.
Thank you, Barbara. It is indeed a great pleasure for me also to welcome each and every one of you, speakers, commentators, and participants, and to thank you for your presence at what we trust will be a very interesting and stimulating exchange of ideas. You greatly honor the University of San Francisco Center for the Pacific Rim and Ricci Institute, and we hope that everyone will be actively engaged in the discussions. When Professor Uhaley first proposed the theme of this symposium, I must confess that I was less than enthusiastic. I wondered if he thought that he and others had some foreknowledge of exactly what the future would be in a fundamentally unpredictable situation dependent upon so many opposing contingent factors. However, upon further reflection, I realized that pondering these factors, social, political, economic, cultural, and religious, as they exist now in the Greater China area, will be of immense benefit. Such investigation will not allow us to foresee with certainty and in detail exactly what will happen after July 1st. But such reflection will definitely help us to understand with greater clarity what will have happened and to relate more effectively to that new reality. This endeavor, therefore, is eminently worthwhile and I trust will serve us well into the future. And so for this, our heartfelt thanks to Professor Uhaley, to all of those who accepted his invitation to share the results of their study, and to the executive director and staff of the Center for the Pacific Rim who oversaw all the numerous details which allow us finally to be together. I am happy to say that the spirit which animates the sponsors of this symposium, namely the Center for the Pacific Rim and the Ricci Institute for Chinese Western Cultural History, is a spirit of friendship towards China, towards Hong Kong, and towards the entire area which can be called Greater China. Perhaps even more than a spirit of friendship, it is a family spirit, in accord with the beautiful Chinese proverb, Tian Xia Yi Jia. Under heaven, there is really only one family. And so all of us, Chinese and those of other nationalities, who during these 2 days will express our questions and concerns, our hopes and our fears regarding the future of the people of Hong Kong and the Greater China region, should be thought of not as outsiders interfering in someone else's internal affairs, but rather as members of one human family who live together on one earth under one heaven. Thank you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Stephen Uhaley, as Barbara said, the first full-time holder of the Kiriyama Chair for Pacific Rim Studies at the University of San Francisco, the inspiration of this conference.
Thank you, Dr. Bundy and Father Malatesta, for the honor of holding this chair this year, and for the association with yourselves under your inspired leadership on this campus, and with your fine colleagues and staff at this beautiful site. I also want to welcome all of you this morning and thank you for being with us. This includes especially those who have come from afar, our contingent from East Asia, 2 people from Hong Kong, Reverend Kwok and Professor Cindy Chu, Professor Chu Yun Han from National Taiwan University, and Professor Pan Wei from Beidao, from Peking University. And from within the country here we have Professor John Zhao from Washington, D.C., the American University, and a little bit closer afield, Professor Zheng Chuyuan from Ball State University. Professor Zhang is president of the American Association for Chinese Studies. And Professor Emmanuel Xu from Santa Barbara, and John Fincher, Professor John Fincher, emeritus of Australia National University, teaching in Oregon, has come down to be with us. I thank you all for your interest and support. To the point that Father Malatesta raised about the theme of this conference, I should confess that it goes back a long ways, actually. When I was an undergraduate at UC Riverside, I wrote my senior thesis on the subject of the first Opium War and the Nanjing settlement. It was a shocker to my committee because it was well over 100 pages. But one reason it was so long is because I tried to present those issues and the acquisition of Hong Kong at that time from both perspectives. And that took some doing, I thought. In any case, I learned a little bit about that end of the story, how Hong Kong came to be alienated from China. And so now it's a real pleasure to have had this opportunity to play a role in a conference of this magnitude and importance on the end game of this story that has been going on for 155 years in East Asia. And again, with an opportunity to look at the basic issues and their implications, in this case for Hong Kong, for the other parts of China, and for others in the region, from differing perspectives. I think that's so important. And we have the help this time. It's not just a mere senior thesis, but a world-class gathering of truly outstanding scholars. And the success is fairly likely, at least, because we have with us the country's foremost Asian scholar who will give the summary at the end of our 2 days together. And his task is facilitated by the quality of input in the time that precedes his summation. And it begins this morning with our first panel, which is keynoted by two very distinguished scholars, Professor Emmanuel Xu and Professor Fred Wakeman. I am on this first panel too, but it's only because I am the conference chairman. And so my paper will have to be endured, but then we can get on to the more valuable input. And I should say that following this first panel, we will go straight away to the second panel, so that chairman of that panel, Dean Orville Schell, can get underway. There will be two presentations, his own and Mike Chinoy of CNN. And then they are going to have to depart, as Dr. Bundy has pointed out. There will be a brief break at that time for people to stretch and otherwise. And then we will resume fairly quickly. Lynn Joyner will take over as chair, and we will proceed with the other two papers and discussion. We will operate basically in this way throughout the conference. There will not be the normal introductions. You all have bios of everyone who is participating in the conference. The papers will be presented in about 20 minutes' time, and there will be some discussion, formal discussion, and then with the time remaining, there will be questions and answers from the others who are present. I think that with that, we will now move right into the first panel. Maybe Fred, if you could come up here, Professor Xu. Now, as conference chairman, I would like to exercise my prerogative to break the rules that I have just established by saying something about our first panel chair. He is, after all, the keynoter panel chair of the conference. But that he is a well-known scholar, I'm sure that you already know, and you will see in the bio statement about him. But I would like to say something of a personal nature. When I was a doctoral student at Berkeley many years ago, when the Center for Chinese Studies was first established, there was no course at that time at Berkeley specifically on Qing documents, on reading Qing documents. And there was such a course at Harvard being taught by John Fairbank. And lo and behold, we had a student of John Fairbank's who was well versed in Qing documents. And myself and 3 or 4 other colleagues prevailed upon this student of Fairbank to give us such a course, which in fact he did do very conscientiously over that year that he was with us. And he did so in addition to his other responsibilities, another seminar that he was teaching and busily doing his own scholarship. It was an act of great generosity on his part. That scholar, that young scholar visiting from Harvard, is Professor Emmanuel Xu. And with that, I will turn the conference over to him.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be with you this morning. I should like to make a short introduction before we start the session. As a student of modern Chinese history of the last 400 years, I've thought very long and hard about the course of the development of modern China and what does China really want. When we come here to study the return of Hong Kong, it seems to me, from the historical perspective, it is not just the return of a stolen piece of territory. It is a monumental event in the history of the diplomacy of imperialism. It signifies the end of a century of foreign imperialism in China. Doubtless, this is a great accomplishment of the PRC, but even more so, it is the crowning success of the Chinese people after more than a century of struggle for independence and respect. The efforts of the earlier modernizers, such as those involved in the self-strengthening movement of the late 19th century, the 100-Day Reform, Kang and Liang, the Republican Revolution under Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the May 4th movement, the nationalist decade of nation building, and the Maoist revolution, all must be given proper credit to make this possible. Now that China has stood up, what does she really want? There are debates on the East Coast as to whether the United States should pursue a containment policy before it is too late, or whether the United States should engage in constructive engagement with China. I thought long and hard about the inner desire of the Chinese people. What do I see? It seems to me that the Chinese people want to build a country that is neither Confucian nor Western, but both Chinese and Western, but totally modern, with a rightful place in the family of nations. This place today is as a regional superpower in Asia and as an emergent superpower in the world. A regional superpower and an emergent superpower. A regional superpower in Asia and an emergent superpower in the world. By 2020 AD, China and the United States will be the two superpowers. Both must learn to live with each other in order to have world peace. China's international position, in my humble assessment, is the best since the time of Emperor Qianlong in the mid-18th century. But even though China has gained power, status, economic progress, it is not likely to invade other smaller countries on her periphery, but perhaps will influence in more or less cultural affairs and other type of influence reminiscent of the old Sinitic tradition. I don't think China will be an aggressor. I hope the United States and China will learn to live with each other so that we'll have a new century of peace and co-prosperity. Thank you.
Those were very good comments to begin the conference with. My paper on the reversion in the perspective of Greater China. As dramatic and problematical as Hong Kong's transfer of sovereignty is, it is worth noting to begin with that it is hardly an isolated, momentous change today, for it takes place in a maelstrom of profound contemporary changes that are transforming much of the world. What is happening in fast-growing East Asia, in the realm of Greater China itself, occurs in this pervasive, globally broad, exceedingly surcharged and changeful environment, with the digital, information, communications, transportation, molecular, and other revolutions underway, full ahead and accelerating of late. We are all in the perilous, or at least very interesting, transverse of what is truly one of the infrequent divides in human history. The changes affect profoundly the global economy, the political order throughout the world at various levels, as well as many of our social institutions and values. Just how it will all come together on the other side of this great volatile divide remains to be seen. The Chinese throughout Greater China are caught up in these same pervasive global developments and uncertainties, even as they try to cope with the enormous changes and challenges that are quite unique to their own experience. Mainland China itself is deeply immersed in its own unprecedented adventure of growing out of the plan, as Barry Naughton puts it. Yet presiding over market-inspired reform does not come naturally for an avowedly communist party. Given such circumstances, it is remarkable that China's leadership has done so well. Their economic success is registered in the face of a most daunting economic factor mix, a mix characterized by the extraordinarily large and growing population on the one hand, and a comparatively modest arable land base on the other. A sobering comparison, even though this mix has proven itself to be amazingly productive in recent years. Nevertheless, these fundamental factors give China's leaders little margin for error, yet that margin is being tested. There are nagging, growing problems which are well known and which I will not repeat here. In the meanwhile, there are also baffling contradictions in the regime's improvised developmental approach that make the road ahead treacherous. The contradictions that are born of systemic change, of adhering to an ideology that no longer seems to apply with the policies that are being implemented. While China's economic success thus far has promisingly reduced the gap between the affluent sectors of the mainland on the one hand and Hong Kong and Taiwan on the other, such contradictions raise concern about the continued vulnerabilities of the mainland system, the system that is, of course, the overwhelmingly largest component within the one country, two systems formula. Add to this political uncertainties, exacerbated this historic year by Deng Xiaoping's long-awaited passing, and the consequently heightened political maneuvering and compromising that is underway, is without the benefit of the systemic political reforms that might be revitalizing governance in China. Such serious reforms having once again been explicitly deferred. This is particularly unfortunate, inasmuch as democratic sentiment and practices have continued to evolve in both Hong Kong and Taiwan during the same period of time that essential political reforms on the mainland have been evaded. Hong Kong came to be alienated from China when the latter's fortunes were at low ebb in the 19th century. Hong Kong then was a relatively isolated place with only a small fishing population. The Manchus put the best face on matters by construing it to be an isolated location where the British could find respite and storage after their long sea voyage. The British were themselves of divided minds on the choice of location for such an enclave. One ranking Englishman at the time favored Chusan Island instead, near Shanghai, arguing that Hong Kong, in quote, in its present condition was not only an utterly useless island to us in a commercial point of view, but it is hopeless to imagine or expect that it can ever be rendered capable of becoming an emporium, end quote. Indeed, Hong Kong was, for a long time, not all that important. The opening of Shanghai to trade was far more important, and that city soon eclipsed Hong Kong in most respects, and particularly so following another war ending in 1860, which opened access to the interior of China. It was on this occasion that Kowloon Peninsula, along with Stonecutters Island, were ceded. A concession, again, that was by comparison a modest one and located far away in the south, away from the main action. It was in 1898, during the infamous scramble for concessions, that the much larger tract known as the New Territories came to be leased for 99 years. Now the cycle of history has largely reversed itself. Great Britain, long shorn of most of its empire, is in much reduced circumstances. By as early as 1952, London had already explicitly abandoned the idea of defending Hong Kong. In fact, for decades already, the British had been living on borrowed time in Hong Kong. Few had expected them to still be there by the mid-20th century. In any case, in the years since 1952, Hong Kong has changed, unbelievably changed, even to the point of now comparing favorably with the former metropolitan power in various respects. For example, its per capita GDP has in the last 5 years actually come to exceed that of Britain's. Negotiations regarding the transfer finally began only in 1982, resulting in the Sino-British Joint Declaration 2 years later. This document announced China's policy toward Hong Kong, highlighting the principle of one country, two systems, a formula that had initially been designed with a view to Taiwan, but which was now seen as fortuitously applicable to Hong Kong. The next several years were given to the painstaking drafting of the basic law called for in the joint declaration that would serve as Hong Kong's mini-constitution. This basic law for the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region was finally approved in Beijing in 1991. The basic law affirmed that Hong Kong is to have a high degree of autonomy. Hong Kong people are to govern Hong Kong. The current economic system and way of life in Hong Kong is to remain unchanged for a period of 50 years. That was in 1991 that the basic law was promulgated. Unfortunately, however, the June 4th, 1989 Tiananmen massacre and the massive popular protests in Hong Kong that it provoked had already changed matters. In order to bolster flagging morale in Hong Kong, London began changing its policy regarding the transfer. For one, it decided to go ahead with the building of the new airport at Chek Lap Kok without Beijing's consent, making this important investment in Hong Kong's future for a long while a contentious issue. Similarly, in 1991, even after the passage of the Basic Law, it approved a new Bill of Rights ordinance for Hong Kong, despite Beijing's objections. Differences escalated in 1993, when the new governor, Christopher Patten, arrived with a mandate to institute representative government in Hong Kong. A series of reforms soon led to the first wholly elected Legislative Council, LegCo, in 1995. The notion of a through-train LegCo that had previously been agreed to when both sides had been cooperating on a convergence approach to the transfer had been abandoned. For its part, Beijing announced that the new LegCo would be dissolved and then arranged for an alternative provisional LegCo to take over this July 1st, to act until a newly constituted one can come into being sometime during the coming year. That new body will be constructed along the more conservative lines outlined in the Basic Law. The more conservative regimen was the product of a united front consensus between the Hong Kong upper business elite and Beijing, which together shared a concern primarily for stability and prosperity rather than democratic rights. Beijing has subsequently brought itself to accept the emergence of new political parties in Hong Kong, inasmuch as it has taken sides among them, but it is clearly distrustful of the popular and critical Democrats who are not represented in the new carefully selected provisional LegCo, even though they have a majority of elected seats at present. Hence, do the Democrats, for their part, also remain suspicious and critical. The British and Beijing have nothing more to say to each other regarding the political structure of Hong Kong, but there has been cooperation on most matters. Still, questions remain, and they are multifold. Will Hong Kong's legendary efficiency begin to erode? Will Chinese officials refrain from intervention in Hong Kong's affairs? Will academe, the media, and religious organizations continue to flourish, or will they too readily self-censor themselves, losing too quickly the vitality that has distinguished these institutions in Hong Kong in recent years? Will the loss of freedom, which has been so important in Hong Kong's success, diminish its future prospects? In fact, I believe that there is reason for optimism, at least for a time. Hong Kong's autonomy and viability seems to be guaranteed by three considerations. First is the prideful desire of the Chinese government to demonstrate that Hong Kong can prosper just as well under Chinese sovereignty as it did under the British, a matter of faith. Second, Hong Kong's economic health will continue to be important to China's growing economy, which is exceedingly important for China's leadership politically. Third, there is the all-important need to demonstrate the successful application of the one country, two systems formula for Taiwan's benefit, and this taking place on the international stage. Taiwan's own impressive economic prosperity and thickening economic relationship with the mainland, largely through Hong Kong, has been complemented by amazing political progress in recent years. Taiwan's direct election of its president last year, a truly significant historic first for China, has been the high watermark thus far of this process. And the National Development Conference of late last December illustrated exceptional further political maturity. Unfortunately, neither event impressed Beijing. The final comments here are under the subtitle, A Truly Greater China, ? Economically, Hong Kong is already rather thoroughly integrated with the mainland, as is the mainland in turn heavily invested in Hong Kong. This integration has helped give the Pearl River Delta region as a whole pride of place in the modernization of China so far. Hong Kong generates impulses of energy and transmits ideas and culture that radiate throughout China. However much some of this may be irritating, particularly in the north. Thus, whatever the questions may be about the quality of life in Hong Kong henceforth, a further question looms regarding Hong Kong's place as it is more formally and firmly situated within the Chinese firmament. In this respect, the relationship of Hong Kong and Shanghai in the years ahead should be interesting. It is a relationship in which ultimately Shanghai is likely to become paramount once again. Of course, Hong Kong will never again be eclipsed to the degree it was in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And competition between the two cities can be expected that will not necessarily be bad for the country. In fact, if everything goes well for China, these two, and if political and other impediments are removed, these two prosperous, forward-looking cities, among others, will represent a truly formidable China. It is China thought of in this respect as a formidable entity, a superpower, a greater China that requires some attention to what is meant by greater China. While the adjective greater is benignly used with reference to metropolitan urban areas, it takes on a troubling hegemonistic connotation when used with reference to a country. We use the term here because it has become a popular one in common parlance and does seem to catch something of the spirit of what is going on in China and among many Chinese, something that the term cultural China fails to fully convey, especially with regard to this triangular combination of mainland China, Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. We also use it specifically with reference to the economic integration that is taking place, and not for the time being in terms of political integration. Although this is what is now occurring in its unique way in Hong Kong's return to China. The ambiguity of the term Greater China is why we enclose it for the time being in quotation marks. We may hope that all will go well with Hong Kong and with China and all the Chinese constituencies. There will always be problems, of course, but the biggest problem for the present is the character of the Chinese government itself and its continued resistance to serious political reforms. It is nice to be able to acknowledge that China is a much more relaxed and comfortable place these days than it had been before the Deng era. But Tiananmen remains a specter that hovers all the more hauntingly as a result of the current crackdowns on dissent, by the continued restraints on the Chinese media, by the sporadic harassment of religious expression, by the less than satisfactory atmosphere in Chinese academia. It is disappointing that at this exciting moment in history, as the Communist Party is preparing a leadership roster that is expected to bridge the trans-century, trans-millennial period, that the opportunity to get on with the postponed structural political reforms of the party's own devising during the late 1980s is once again postponed. The pity is that it is only when such political reforms are truly pursued to the end of realizing an effectively accountable government that the people of Hong Kong can really feel comfortable as part of the motherland. Only then, in all likelihood, will a reasonable settlement with Taiwan be achieved. Only then will regional neighbors feel more fully secure. Only then will China be satisfyingly online with the new information revolution, deriving full benefit from it. Only then will the appellation Greater China signify a country that truly is greater than it has had the opportunity to be in the recent past. Thank you for your attention.
Professor Hsu, who's I have long been an admirer of. I was reminded when he was speaking about this momentous historical moment of the reversion of Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty, of his own earlier work, which had a great influence on me, on the diplomacy of the mid-19th century, and especially the Ely crisis. This whole 155 years that Steve referred to, which marks an end to the British Empire, is not only momentous, it is extraordinarily significant in terms of the history of the globe. Steve and I were students together at Berkeley, and we're old friends, so we share a lot in our own common formation. And although I have not read his master's thesis, which I probably should have, my own doctoral thesis was on the Opium War, and on, in part, the acquisition of Hong Kong and the diplomacy of Palmerston and Queen Victoria and so forth, so that I too come at this from a sense of the jingoistic Britain, as Professor Hsu has pointed out, and this moment of historic justice, if I may say so. Let me open. Let me open with a contrast that struck me very strongly, and that, in a sense, impelled me into research on the city of Shanghai, which I've been studying very closely for the past several years. My first visit to mainland China, having lived for many years in Taiwan, was after the Nixon visit and the Shanghai Communique, and I went, as most China experts did in those days, as an interpreter with a scientific delegation. We entered, of course, in those days. You had to go in via Hong Kong and via Canton, and we ended up during the first stage of this mission in Shanghai. And I remember so very vividly looking down from my hotel room the first night in Shanghai on this city that was a city out of a time warp. With its, we were staying in the Jinjiang Hotel, which was built, the Cathay Mansions, which was built under imperialism. And here was a city that was architecturally composed as a monument, truly a monument to imperialism. I mean, if you stand on the, even today, on the Bund, which has been repaved, so to speak, what you see are those incredible buildings that the British Empire erected and that Thomas Metcalfe has written about, that in their own granite majesty are designed to sway and awe the onlooker. And yet the entire city, of course, was no longer was no longer an imperialist outpost. And then returning, by way of contrast, returning after a month or so in China to Hong Kong via Shenzhen, walking across that bridge and getting on the train, and suddenly spotting what has to be seen as the capital of capitalism, as the train passes through Shatian and on and down into Kowloon, is an amazing contrast, or certainly was an amazing contrast in the early 1970s. So that image sticks in my mind as I think about what's going to be happening in another few weeks. In fact, I will be in Hong Kong on June 30th giving a speech at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, even as the turnover takes place. And in so many ways, the contrast between this colonial period of rule and what will be at one level not only accepted but applauded by those of us who have reeled under the impact of imperialism and colonialism will also be met with a sense of profound ambivalence. And I guess that's what I really want to talk about today. Let me try to express this ambivalence as follows. In the West, and particularly in the United States, in the last 4 years, there's been a major debate over the issue of civil society and the public sphere. This has spun off of the work of Jürgen Habermas, the German philosopher, and it has led to a debate, a major debate, in which I would say the majority of scholars have argued that there existed in China in the end of the 19th century and in the early years of the Republican era a civil society, in our sense of a civil society. I must tell you that I have been on the negative side of this debate, though my feelings are not as strong as they once were about this. The reason for the centrality of the debate is simply the following. Does there exist in Chinese society a strong tradition of democratic formation? We have in the audience today Professor Fincher, who has written very movingly on this and quite persuasively, and probably he and I differ on the issue. But the issue is germane because it has to do with the future of the greater China that Professor Uhaley was talking about. Is there in the Chinese political repertoire a tradition of civil dissent and civil formation that will permit the arrival or revival of democracy in China under the conditions that Professor Uhaley was talking about just a few moments ago? Now, the contrast I want to draw is the following. I gave a paper in this was several years ago, in Shanghai, where I argued that this was a Western transplantation That is, it did not conform with the reality of Chinese political culture to imagine that such a civil society existed. That paper was greeted with unanimous acclaim by the Chinese scholars, many of them younger people who obviously sympathized with this was the year after Tiananmen, with the dissidents at Tiananmen, who agreed with me that this civil society did not exist. I was really struck by that unanimity. 2 weeks later, I gave the same paper in Hong Kong, and exactly the opposite reaction occurred. Several of Martin Lee's, whom I know, several of Martin Lee's followers were in the audience. It was given at the University of Hong Kong, which is a colonial university. And the reaction was exactly the opposite. In fact, it was one of furious outrage. How dare I, as a Westerner, claim that China did not have a democratic tradition? And the reason for this difference was quite obvious. The desire, the hopes, the wish for some sort of democratic outcome, especially after the Tiananmen incident, was so strong among young Hong Kong students that they found my remarks offensive. Whereas, as I say, in Shanghai, the same generation found them totally acceptable and, in fact, applauded me for being realistic about the nature of Chinese society. This is the contrast we're talking about. Now, as I told you, and I don't want to cede my time, so I'll restrict my remarks accordingly, I spent a lot of time studying Shanghai. Right now I'm writing a book on the, quote, liberation, unquote, of Shanghai. And what is most striking in my research on this topic is the degree of preparation that the authorities took, that the communists took, before they moved into the city. The analogy is not perfect, as I'll mention in a moment, but the degree of preparation was absolutely unbelievable. Let me give you an example. Because the most important element in public order is the police, the Chinese Communist Party began recruiting putative, soon-to-be police cadres after Mao announced in January of 1949 that they were going to take the South. They were going to cross the Yangtze River. Special training camps were set up in Shandong province. Young people who were interested in security work were recruited. The underground communist cells, of which you can be sure there are many in the Hong Kong police force right now, began sending their members to Shandong ostensibly to visit relatives. And they brought with them their records and their experience to brief these cadres to be. The night that the PLA moved into Shanghai, the Taiwanese, the nationalist chief of police fled to Taiwan, leaving his deputy behind ostensibly to organize a resistance movement against the communists. The deputy was a clandestine member of the Chinese Communist Party. By 3 a.m. of that next morning, May 9th, the police force was mobilized to accept the communists. When the PLA cadres moved in that morning to the Fuzhou Road police station, which was the headquarters of the Shanghai police, the entire police force's commandants were outside with keys to the station and all of the material that was needed for the new government to take over. By 8 in the morning, the new cadres, who had been briefed as to which office to go to, which desk to occupy, were in place, and the transition was over. Now that has already taken place. Shenzhen has been a training ground for those who will be moving into the city to take over the morning of July 1st. As you know, the communist authorities have agreed to postpone their movement into the city until well after midnight, though they could by rights take it then, and will be in full command by the morning of the following day. I don't cite this to you to arouse some specter of police dictatorship, but simply to note that the thoroughness of preparation, no doubt, is just as meticulous for Hong Kong as it was for Shanghai nearly half a century ago. Let me note that the analogy is not very perfect. In fact, a far better analogy, and I say this at the risk of incurring brickbats, the analogy is far more perfect in terms of the nationalists taking over Taiwan after the Japanese were defeated in 1945. In other words, a colonial authority has to leave. We know the nationalists botched it badly. February 28, 1947, when the massacres began, and when Cheney, that's the nationalist Cheney, attacked the Taiwanese, was an instance of how badly one could handle that kind of takeover. And I certainly hope that, forgive me, the communists are smarter than the nationalists when it comes to taking over Hong Kong. But what I would like to stress is the issue which is also present in the Shanghai case, even to a certain extent in the Taiwan case, of ambivalence. Because I really see the ambivalence as constituting the heart of the issue of reversion and the new administration of Hong Kong. We can talk about one country, two systems, but to me, what this comes down to in practice is a question of attitude. And I'll tell you quite frankly, as a China watcher, I don't know which attitude is going to prevail. What do I mean by that? One attitude is the attitude, and this is the cause for the optimism on the part of some in Hong Kong. Namely, that so much money has been invested there. As you probably know, people who are raking off well, let me put it this way. I've got to watch myself. Many state-owned enterprises in China hang out Chinese word is to hang out a placard, essentially rent out or use their premises for private enterprise. The profits from those private enterprises are invested in Hong Kong, often in holding companies that are deliberately undervalued. And also, of course, in Hong Kong real estate, which is one reason for the tremendous bubble of Hong Kong real estate prices. In other words, Hong Kong is a tremendous cash cow for entrepreneurs in mainland China. So, from that perspective, there would be no reason at all to even begin to damage the independent fiscal integrity of Hong Kong. It would be in the interest of many of these enterprises and their entrepreneurs to maintain Hong Kong as a safe haven for what might be called deviant Chinese capitalism. Now, if that scenario is correct, we can look forward to the maintenance of Hong Kong truly as another system under that formula of one country and two systems. But there is another countervailing impulse, which I pick up because I I spent a lot of time studying the police, which is a much darker side of things. Before I turn to this final point, bracket this by saying, I'm a consultant to the U.S. Department of Justice on criminal organizations. And one of the interesting things is to watch the development that is taking place now between the triads of Hong Kong and the criminal gangs of Shanghai. We have this competition between the two cities. Shanghai would like to believe that it will become the financial capital of China and supplant Hong Kong. And that is not something that is simply implicit. I mean, this is explicitly declared by Shanghai authorities. But at the same time, there is this criminal collusion, which also involves, because as Yi Shou Liang the Chinese Public Security Bureau and these criminal gangs are very closely allied. This alliance between Hong Kong and Shanghai criminal organizations is taking ever larger proportions. Having parenthetically bracketed that for you, let me turn to what I see as the second motive, which is where the ambivalence comes from. If you listen to or if you monitor the statements of the military and paramilitary police, the People's Armed Police, in Shenzhen, where they now have a garrison of 10,000 troops, you get a very different picture of what Hong Kong could be. It is when I said the capital of capitalism, it is the center of possible subversion. It is where dissent may appear. It is where the authorities must be prepared to crack down. Now, I see the same tension in Shanghai between 1951 and 1954, with a continual debate within the leadership of the Communist Party, which was then run under the authority of the East China Military Commission, between these two different points of view. And in fact, with the purge eventually of the man who was most closely associated with coordination with the capitalists of Shanghai, Pan Hanyan. I've discussed this with Xu Dixin, who was the man in charge of the Industrial Commission. There was a constant tug of war between these two different perspectives. Now, I tend to be more of a pessimist than an optimist, as you could probably guess. I hope it turns out best for the former and that the latter don't prevail. Thank you.
We have a few minutes before winding up this session. I should like to make a short comment on Professor Yu Haley's paper, and then the session is open to the floor. In his earlier discussion of the place of Hong Kong as not very significant in 1842, I agree as a place it is not significant, but as a place to be ceded by the Qing dynasty or foreign power, it's very, very significant. In my study of the Qing documents, Emperor Daoguang was much, much troubled by the text of the Treaty of Nanking. He was less troubled by the indemnity of $21 million to the barbarians. The barbarians could be paid off. But to lose a piece of territory conquered by the founding father of the dynasty was unforgivable. Emperor Daoguang could not sleep at night, walked and said, I couldn't do it. Delayed for a few days. In the end, the British gunboat made him realize he had to swallow his pride. And therefore, this insignificant place, perhaps from the British viewpoint, was ceded to a foreign power, but it was a great, great humiliation and a very significant event for the Qing dynasty to lose the place. Thank you. Any other questions to any one of us? Yeah.
If possible, does the did the Triad and Shanghai criminal activities gain from U.S. contingents? And could possible U.S. involvement influence either Triad or Shanghai criminal power with their contingents here in the United States?
I'd rather not answer that. Are you a journalist? Okay. Well, the answer is yes. Indeed, I think one of the well, it's not unexpected, but I'm sure it's not really terribly well prepared for consequences of the reversion of Hong Kong is going to be a massive efflux of criminal influence to this country, and particularly the West Coast. And that's why I really can't answer you, because as I said, I'm a consultant for the Department of Justice on this. I'm not sure we're prepared for this outcome. And of course, it's mainly in narcotics, but also it's a very complicated picture, because it also involves weapons from mainland China that are distributed in Japan and in Taiwan through these criminal gangs, so that there is an alliance not just between the Triads and the Shanghai, what is now the revival of the Green Gang, but also the Yakuza, the various gumi in Japan. Now, what effect will the U.S. have on them? I mean, I'm not suggesting that anything that our authorities can do is going to have an effect on them. What I'm saying is that the general problem in this country of narcotics addiction and substance abuse is obviously going to have an effect on them. They've become increasingly prominent in the drug trade, and that, I think, is going to continue. And the fact that even though there is growing drug abuse in China, in mainland China, the authorities there are less likely to condone it than we are. So in a way, the severity of mainland Chinese police measures against drug abuse may well lead to a kind of diversion of interest towards softer markets, if you follow me.
In Hong Kong, the power of the Triad is so strong that both restaurants and bars, and, for instance, the parking spaces in Hong Kong on city streets are all controlled by the Triad.
Sure.
Now, where would the Department hand over? Do you expect the Chinese police or the Chinese government to take more control in controlling the Triad, or do you see it actually even growing stronger in their influence upon small businesses?
That's a very good question, and I say that's a very good question not to flatter you, but because I think it could go either way. If I think back to the Shanghai analogy, when they had to break the power of the gangs, what they did was they co-opted members of the gangs for two to 3 years, and then they cracked down on them. The most important one was a man named Huang Jinrong. And after they co-opted him, and he turned over control of a major part of control of the Green Gang to them, and then they killed him after 3 years. So it could well be a case of that. I mean, I just don't know. The problem now is, when I was alluding to the connection between Hong Kong and Shanghai, is that the police are becoming the mainland police are becoming so involved in illicit activities. The largest brothel in Shanghai is run by the police. They're becoming so involved in illicit activities that it would be very tempting for them to cooperate with the Triads, whose influence within the Hong Kong police, as you must know from your question, is extraordinary. And whether or not they'll decide, I mean, I can easily imagine, and this is sheer speculation, a major debate at that level, at higher security levels, between those who would say, let's ride with these guys and use them, and those who would say, we can't do this. It's going to be very much like the mafia in Italy. We're now observing these incredible trials in Italy where the former leading prime minister is under 2 different trials, it could very easily become something of that nature, and it would implicate the entire eastern seaboard of China. I don't want to. I mean, I study this stuff, so obviously it occupies more of my imagination than it probably should. But it's really a major problem, and you're right to put the question that way. Thank you.
I think the time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Xu. Orville, why don't you come right on up here? Thank you. And Mike Shinoy, why don't you come up? The other members of the panel, perhaps.
Let's do this. Maybe I'll just say some introductory things, and you want to talk for like 15, 20 minutes? Yeah. And then we'll kind of give a very quick sort of state of play. It's Stanley's actually, and we have time. We might let him go before we leave. That'd be great. And then we can have some questions. Yeah. Sure? Okay. Good. How long is today? Well, it's not real.